The Idea of a University. By John Henry Newman. Introductory note. John Henry Newman was born in London, February 21, 1801. Going up to Oxford at 16, he gained a scholarship at Trinity College, and after graduation became Fellow and Tutor of Oriel, then the most alive, intellectually, of the Oxford colleges. He took orders, and in 1828 was appointed Vicar of St. Mary's, the University Church. In 1832 he had to resign his tutorship on account of a difference of opinion with the head of the college as to his duties and responsibilities, Newman regarding his function as one of a substantially religious nature. Returning to Oxford the next year from a journey on the continent, he began, in cooperation with R. H. Froude and others, the publication of the Tracts for the Times, a series of pamphlets which gave a name to the Tractarian or Oxford movement for the defence of the doctrine of apostolical succession and the integrity of the prayer book. After several years of agitation, during which Newman came to exercise an extraordinary influence in Oxford, the movement and its leader fell under the official ban of the university and of the Anglican bishops, and Newman withdrew from Oxford, feeling that the Anglican Church had herself destroyed the defences which he had sought to build for her. In October, 1845, he was received into the Roman Church. The next year he went to Rome, and on his return introduced into England the Institute of the Oratory. In 1854 he went to Dublin for 4 years as rector of the new Catholic University, and while there wrote his volume on the idea of a university, in which he expounds with wonderful clearness of thought and beauty of language his view of the aim of education. In 1879 he was created cardinal in recognition of his services to the cause of religion in England, and in 1890 he died. Of the history of Newman's religious opinions and influence no hint can be given here. The essays which follow do, indeed, imply important and fundamental elements of his system of belief, but they can be taken in detachment as the exposition of a view of the nature and value of culture by a man who was himself the fine flower of English university training and a master of English prose. The Idea of a University. What is a university? If I were asked to describe as briefly and popularly as I could, what a university was, I should draw my answer from its ancient designation of a studium generale, or school of universal learning. This description implies the assemblage of strangers from all parts in one spot, from all parts, else, how will you find professors and students for every department of knowledge? And in one spot, else, how can there be any school at all? Accordingly, in its simple and rudimental form, it is a school of knowledge of every kind, consisting of teachers and learners from every quarter. Many things are requisite to complete and satisfy the idea embodied in this description, but such as this a university seems to be in its essence, a place for the communication and circulation of thought, by means of personal intercourse, through a wide extent of country. There is nothing far-fetched or unreasonable in the idea thus presented to us, and if this be a university, then a university does but contemplate a necessity of our nature, and is but one specimen in a particular medium, out of many which might be adduced in others, of a provision for that necessity. Mutual education, in a large sense of the word, is one of the great and incessant occupations of human society, carried on partly with set purpose, and partly not. One generation forms another, and the existing generation is ever acting and reacting upon itself in the persons of its individual members. Now, in this process, books, I need scarcely say, that is, the litera scripta, are one special instrument. It is true, and emphatically so in this age. Considering the prodigious powers of the press, and how they are developed at this time in the never-intermitting issue of periodicals, tracts, pamphlets, works in series, and light literature, we must allow there never was a time which promised fairer for dispensing with every other means of information and instruction. What can we want more, you will say, for the intellectual education of the whole man, and for every man, than so exuberant and diversified and persistent a promulgation of all kinds of knowledge? Why, you will ask, need we go up to knowledge, when knowledge comes down to us? The Sibyl wrote her prophecies upon the leaves of the forest, and wasted them, but here such careless profusion might be prudently indulged, for it can be afforded without loss, in consequence of the almost fabulous fecundity of the instrument which these latter ages have invented. We have sermons in stones, and books in the running brooks, works larger and more comprehensive than those which have gained for ancients an immortality, issue forth every morning, and are projected onwards to the ends of the earth at the rate of hundreds of miles a day. Our seats are strewed, our pavements are powdered, with swarms of little tracts, and the very bricks of our city walls preach wisdom, by informing us by their placards where we can at once cheaply purchase it. I allow all this, and much more, such certainly is our popular education, and its effects are remarkable. Nevertheless, after all, even in this age, whenever men are really serious about getting what, in the language of trade, is called a good article, when they aim at something precise, something refined, something really luminous, something really large, something choice, they go to another market, they avail themselves, in some shape or other, of the rival method, the ancient methods, of oral instruction, of present communication between man and man, of teachers instead of learning, of the personal influence of a master, and the humble initiation of a disciple, and, in consequence, of great centers of pilgrimage and throng, which such a method of education necessarily involves. This, I think, will be found to hold good in all those departments or aspects of society, which possess an interest sufficient to bind men together, or to constitute what is called a world. It holds in the political world, and in the high world, and in the religious world, and it holds also in the literary and scientific world. If the actions of men may be taken as any test of their convictions, then we have reason for saying this, viz., that the province and the inestimable benefit of the litera scriptu is that of being a record of truth, and an authority of appeals, and an instrument of teaching in the hands of a teacher, but that, if we wish to become exact and fully furnished in any branch of knowledge which is diversified and complicated, we must consult the living man and listen to his living voice. I am not bound to investigate the cause of this, and anything I may say will, I am conscious, be short of its full analysis. Perhaps we may suggest, that no books can get through the number of minute questions which it is possible to ask on any extended subject, or can hit upon the very difficulties which are severally felt by each reader in succession. Or again, that no book can convey the special spirit and delicate peculiarities of its subject with that rapidity and certainty which attend on the sympathy of mind with mind, through the eyes, the look, the accent, and the manner, in casual expressions thrown off at the moment, and the unstudied turns of familiar conversation. But I am already dwelling too long on what is but an incidental portion of my main subject. Whatever be the cause, the fact is undeniable. The general principles of any study you may learn by books at home, but the detail, the color, the tone, the air, the life which makes it live in us, you must catch all these from those in whom it lives already. You must imitate the student in French or German, who is not content with his grammar, but goes to Paris or Dresden. You must take example from the young artist, who aspires to visit the great masters in Florence and in Rome. Till we have discovered some intellectual daguerreotype, which takes off the course of thought, and the form, lineaments, and features of truth, as completely and minutely, as the optical instrument reproduces the sensible object, we must come to the teachers of wisdom to learn wisdom, we must repair to the fountain, and drink there. Portions of it may go from thence to the ends of the earth by means of books, but the fullness is in one place alone. It is in such assemblages and congregations of intellect that books themselves, the masterpieces of human genius, are written, or at least originated. The principle on which I have been insisting is so obvious, and instances in point are so ready, that I should think it tiresome to proceed with the subject, except that one or two illustrations may serve to explain my own language about it, which may not have done justice to the doctrine which it has been intended to enforce. For instance, the polished manners and high bread-bearing which are so difficult of attainment, and so strictly personal when attained, which are so much admired in society, from society are acquired. All that goes to constitute a gentleman, the carriage, gait, address, gestures, voice, the ease, the self-possession, the courtesy, the power of conversing, the talent of not offending, the lofty principle, the delicacy of thought, the happiness of expression, the taste and propriety, the generosity and forbearance, the candor and consideration, the openness of hand. These qualities, some of them come by nature, some of them may be found in any rank, some of them are a direct precept of Christianity, but the full assemblage of them, bound up in the unity of an individual character, do we expect they can be learned from books? Are they not necessarily acquired, where they are to be found, in high society? The very nature of the case leads us to say so. You cannot fence without an antagonist, nor challenge all comers in disputation before you have supported a thesis, and in like manner, it stands to reason, you cannot learn to converse till you have the world to converse with. You cannot unlearn your natural bashfulness, or awkwardness, or stiffness, or other besetting deformity, till you serve your time in some school of manners. Well, and is it not so in matter of fact? The metropolis, the court, the great houses of the land, are the centres to which at stated times the country comes up, as to shrines of refinement and good taste, and then in due time the country goes back again home, enriched with a portion of the social accomplishments, which those very visits serve to call out and heighten in the gracious dispensers of them. We are unable to conceive how the gentlemanlike can otherwise be maintained, and maintained in this way it is. And now a second instance, and here too I am going to speak without personal experience of the subject I am introducing. I admit I have not been in Parliament, any more than I have figured in the beau monde, yet I cannot but think that statesmanship, as well as high breeding, is learned, not by books, but in certain centres of education. If it be not presumption to say so, Parliament puts a clever man au courant with politics and affairs of state in a way surprising to himself. A member of the legislature, if tolerably observant, begins to see things with new eyes, even though his views undergo no change. Words have a meaning now, and ideas a reality, such as they had not before. He hears a vast deal in public speeches and private conversation, which is never put into print. The bearings of measures and events, the action of parties, and the persons of friends and enemies, are brought out to the man who is in the midst of them with a distinctness, which the most diligent perusal of newspapers will fail to impart to them. It is access to the fountain-heads of political wisdom and experience, it is daily intercourse, of one kind or another, with the multitude who go up to them, it is familiarity with business, it is access to the contributions of fact and opinion thrown together by many witnesses from many quarters, which does this for him. However, I need not account for a fact, to which it is sufficient to appeal, that the Houses of Parliament and the atmosphere around them are a sort of university of politics. As regards the world of science, we find a remarkable instance of the principle which I am illustrating, in the periodical meetings for its advance, which have arisen in the course of the last 20 years, such as the British Association. Such gatherings would to many persons appear at first sight simply preposterous. Above all subjects of study, science is conveyed, is propagated, by books, or by private teaching, experiments and investigations are conducted in silence, discoveries are made in solitude. What have philosophers to do with festive celebrities, and panegyrical solemnities with mathematical and physical truth? Yet on a closer attention to the subject, it is found that not even scientific thought can dispense with the suggestions, the instruction, the stimulus, the sympathy, the intercourse with mankind on a large scale, which such meetings secure. A fine time of year is chosen, when days are long, skies are bright, the earth smiles, and all nature rejoices. A city or town is taken by turns, of ancient name or modern opulence, where buildings are spacious and hospitality hearty. The novelty of place and circumstance, the excitement of strange, or the refreshment of well-known faces, the majesty of rank or of genius, the amiable charities of men pleased both with themselves and with each other, the elevated spirits, the circulation of thought, the curiosity, the morning sections, the outdoor exercise, the well-furnished, well-earned board, the not ungraceful hilarity, the evening circle, the brilliant lecture, the discussions or collisions or guesses of great men one with another, the narratives of scientific processes, of hopes, disappointments, conflicts, and successes, the splendid eulogistic orations, these and the like constituents of the annual celebration, are considered to do something real and substantial for the advance of knowledge which can be done in no other way. Of course they can but be occasional, they answer to the annual act, or commencement, or commemoration of a university, not to its ordinary condition, but they are of a university nature, and I can well believe in their utility. They issue in the promotion of a certain living and, as it were, bodily communication of knowledge from one to another, of a general interchange of ideas, and a comparison and adjustment of science with science, of an enlargement of mind, intellectual and social, of an ardent love of the particular study, which may be chosen by each individual, and a noble devotion to its interests. Such meetings, I repeat, are but periodical, and only partially represent the idea of a university. The bustle and whirl which are their usual concomitants, are in ill keeping with the order and gravity of earnest intellectual education. We desiderati means of instruction which involve no interruption of our ordinary habits, nor need we seek it long, for the natural course of things brings it about, while we debate over it. In every great country, the metropolis itself becomes a sort of necessary university, whether we will or no. As the chief city is the seat of the court, of high society, of politics, and of law, so as a matter of course is it the seat of letters also, and at this time, for a long term of years, London and Paris are in fact and in operation universities, though in Paris its famous university is no more, and in London a university scarcely exists except as a board of administration. The newspapers, magazines, reviews, journals, and periodicals of all kinds, the publishing trade, the libraries, museums, and academies there found, the learned and scientific societies, necessarily invest it with the functions of a university, and that atmosphere of intellect, which in a former age hung over Oxford or Bologna or Salamanca, has, with the change of times, moved away to the centre of civil government. Thither come up youths from all parts of the country, the students of law, medicine, and the fine arts, and the employés and attachés of literature. There they live, as chance determines, and they are satisfied with their temporary home, for they find in it all that was promised to them there. They have not come in vain, as far as their own object in coming is concerned. They have not learned any particular religion, but they have learned their own particular profession well. They have, moreover, become acquainted with the habits, manners, and opinions of their place of sojourn, and done their part in maintaining the tradition of them. We cannot then be without virtual universities. A metropolis is such. The simple question is, whether the education sought and given should be based on principle, formed upon rule, directed to the highest ends, or left to the random succession of masters and schools, one after another, with a melancholy waste of thought and an extreme hazard of truth. Religious teaching itself affords us an illustration of our subject to a certain point. It does not indeed seat itself merely in centres of the world. This is impossible from the nature of the case. It is intended for the many, not the few. Its subject matter is truth necessary for us, not truth recondite and rare, but it concurs in the principle of a university so far as this, that its great instrument, or rather organ, has ever been that which nature prescribes in all education, the personal presence of a teacher, or, in theological language, oral tradition. It is the living voice, the breathing form, the expressive countenance, which preaches, which catechizes. Truth, a subtle, invisible, manifold spirit, is poured into the mind of the scholar by his eyes and ears, through his affections, imagination, and reason. It is poured into his mind and is sealed up there in perpetuity, by propounding and repeating it, by questioning and re-questioning, by correcting and explaining, by progressing and then recurring to first principles, by all those ways which are implied in the word catechizing. In the first ages, it was a work of long time. Months, sometimes years, were devoted to the arduous task of disabusing the mind of the incipient Christian of its pagan errors, and of moulding it upon the Christian faith. The Scriptures indeed were at hand for the study of those who could avail themselves of them, but Saint Irenaeus does not hesitate to speak of whole races, who had been converted to Christianity, without being able to read them. To be unable to read or write was in those times no evidence of want of learning. The hermits of the deserts were, in this sense of the word, illiterate, yet the great Saint Anthony, though he knew not letters, was a match in disputation for the learned philosophers who came to try him. Didymus again, the great Alexandrian theologian, was blind. The ancient discipline, called the Disciplina Arcani, involved the same principle. The more sacred doctrines of revelation were not committed to books but passed on by successive tradition. The teaching on the Blessed Trinity and the Eucharist appears to have been so handed down for some 100 years, and when at length reduced to writing, it has filled many folios, yet has not been exhausted. But I have said more than enough in illustration. I end as I began. A university is a place of concourse, whither students come from every quarter for every kind of knowledge. You cannot have the best of every kind everywhere, you must go to some great city or emporium for it. There you have all the choicest productions of nature and art all together, which you find each in its own separate place elsewhere. All the riches of the land, and of the earth, are carried up thither. There are the best markets, and there the best workmen. It is the center of trade, the supreme court of fashion, the umpire of rival talents, and the standard of things rare and precious. It is the place for seeing galleries of first-rate pictures, and for hearing wonderful voices and performers of transcendent skill. It is the place for great preachers, great orators, great nobles, great statesmen. In the nature of things, greatness and unity go together. Excellence implies a center. And such, for the third or fourth time, is a university. I hope I do not weary out the reader by repeating it. It is the place to which 1,000 schools make contributions, in which the intellect may safely range and speculate, sure to find its equal in some antagonist activity, and its judge in the tribunal of truth. It is a place where inquiry is pushed forward, and discoveries verified and perfected, and rashness rendered innocuous, and error exposed, by the collision of mind with mind, and knowledge with knowledge. It is the place where the professor becomes eloquent, and is a missionary and a preacher, displaying his science in its most complete and most winning form, pouring it forth with the zeal of enthusiasm, and lighting up his own love of it in the breasts of his hearers. It is the place where the catechist makes good his ground as he goes, treading in the truth day by day into the ready memory, and wedging and tightening it into the expanding reason. It is a place which wins the admiration of the young by its celebrity, kindles the affections of the middle-aged by its beauty, and rivets the fidelity of the old by its associations. It is a seat of wisdom, a light of the world, a minister of the faith, an alma mater of the rising generation. It is this and a great deal more, and demands a somewhat better head and hand than mine to describe it well. Such is a university in its idea and in its purpose, such in good measure has it before now been in fact. Shall it ever be again? We are going forward in the strength of the cross, under the patronage of the Blessed Virgin, in the name of Saint Patrick, to attempt it. 2. Site of a university. If we would know what a university is, considered in its elementary idea, we must betake ourselves to the first and most celebrated home of European literature and source of European civilization, to the bright and beautiful Athens, whose schools drew to her bosom, and then sent back again to the business of life, the youth of the Western world for a long 1,000 years. Seated on the verge of the continent, the city seemed hardly suited for the duties of a central metropolis of knowledge, yet, what it lost in convenience of approach, it gained in its neighborhood to the traditions of the mysterious East, and in the loveliness of the region in which it lay. Hither, then, as to a sort of ideal land, where all archetypes of the great and the fair were found in substantial being, and all departments of truth explored, and all diversities of intellectual power exhibited, where taste and philosophy were majestically enthroned as in a royal court, where there was no sovereignty but that of mind, and no nobility but that of genius, where professors were rulers, and princes did homage, hither flocked continually from the very corners of the orbis terrarum, the many-tongued generation, just rising, or just risen into manhood, in order to gain wisdom. Pisistratus had in an early age discovered and nursed the infant genius of his people, and Simon, after the Persian War, had given it a home. That war had established the naval supremacy of Athens, she had become an imperial state, and the Ionians, bound to her by the double chain of kindred and of subjection, were importing into her both their merchandise and their civilization. The arts and philosophy of the Asiatic coast were easily carried across the sea, and there was Simon, as I have said, with his ample fortune, ready to receive them with due honors. Not content with patronizing their professors, he built the first of those noble porticos, of which we hear so much in Athens, and he formed the groves, which in process of time became the celebrated academy. Planting is one of the most graceful, as in Athens it was one of the most beneficent, of employments. Simon took in hand the wild wood, pruned and dressed it, and laid it out with handsome walks and welcome fountains. Nor, while hospitable to the authors of the city's civilization, was he ungrateful to the instruments of her prosperity. His trees extended their cool, umbrageous branches over the merchants, who assembled in the Agora, for many generations. Those merchants certainly had deserved that act of bounty, for all the while their ships had been carrying forth the intellectual fame of Athens to the Western world. Then commenced what may be called her university existence. Pericles, who succeeded Simon both in the government and in the patronage of art, is said by Plutarch to have entertained the idea of making Athens the capital of federated Greece. In this he failed, but his encouragement of such men as Phidias and Anaxagoras led the way to her acquiring a far more lasting sovereignty over a far wider empire. Little understanding the sources of her own greatness, Athens would go to war. Peace is the interest of a seat of commerce and the arts, but to war she went, yet to her, whether peace or war, it mattered not. The political power of Athens waned and disappeared, kingdoms rose and fell, centuries rolled away, they did but bring fresh triumphs to the city of the poet and the sage. There at length the swarthy Moor and Spaniard were seen to meet the blue-eyed Gaul, and the Cappadocian, late subject of Mithridates, gazed without alarm at the haughty conquering Roman. Revolution after revolution passed over the face of Europe, as well as of Greece, but still she was there, Athens, the city of mind, as radiant, as splendid, as delicate, as young, as ever she had been. Many a more fruitful coast or isle is washed by the blue Aegean, many a spot is there more beautiful or sublime to see, many a territory more ample, but there was one charm in Attica, which in the same perfection was nowhere else. The deep pastures of Arcadia, the plain of Argos, the Thessalian vale, these had not the gift. Boeotia, which lay to its immediate north, was notorious for its very want of it. The heavy atmosphere of that Boeotia might be good for vegetation, but it was associated in popular belief with the dullness of the Boeotian intellect. On the contrary, the special purity, elasticity, clearness, and salubrity of the air of Attica, fit concomitant and emblem of its genius, did that for it which earth did not. It brought out every bright hue and tender shade of the landscape over which it was spread, and would have illuminated the face even of a more bare and rugged country. A confined triangle, perhaps 50 miles its greatest length, and 30 its greatest breadth, two elevated rocky barriers, meeting at an angle, three prominent mountains, commanding the plain, Parnus, Pentelicus, and Hymettus, an unsatisfactory soil, some streams, not always full, such is about the report which the agent of a London company would have made of Attica. He would report that the climate was mild, the hills were limestone, there was plenty of good marble, more pasture land than at first survey might have been expected, sufficient certainly for sheep and goats, fisheries productive, silver mines once, but long since worked out, figs fair, oil first rate, olives in profusion. But what he would not think of noting down, was, that olive tree was so choice in nature and so noble in shape that it excited a religious veneration, and that it took so kindly to the light soil, as to expand into woods upon the open plain, and to climb up and fringe the hills. He would not think of writing word to his employers, how that clear air, of which I have spoken, brought out, yet blended and subdued the colours on the marble, till they had a softness and harmony, for all their richness, which in a picture looks exaggerated, yet is after all within the truth. He would not tell, how that same delicate and brilliant atmosphere freshened up the pale olive, till the olive forgot its monotony, and its cheek glowed like the arbutus or beech of the Umbrian hills. he would say nothing of the thyme and thousand fragrant herbs which carpeted Hymettus, he would hear nothing of the hum of its bees, nor take much account of the rare flavour of its honey, since Gozo and Minorca were sufficient for the English demand. He would look over the Aegean from the height he had ascended, he would follow with his eye the chain of islands, which, starting from the Simian headland, seemed to offer the fabled divinities of Attica, when they would visit their Ionian cousins, a sort of viaduct thereto across the sea, but that fancy would not occur to him, nor any admiration of the dark violet billows with their white edges down below, nor of those graceful, fan-like jets of silver upon the rocks, which slowly rise aloft like water spirits from the deep, then shiver, and break, and spread, and shroud themselves, and disappear, in a soft mist of foam, nor of the gentle, incessant heaving and panting of the whole liquid plain, nor of the long waves, keeping steady time, like a line of soldiery, as they resound upon the hollow shore. He would not deign to notice that restless living element at all, except to bless his stars that he was not upon it. Nor the distinct detail, nor the refined colouring, nor the graceful outline and roseate golden hue of the jutting crags, nor the bold shadows cast from Otus or Laurio by the declining sun. Our agent of a mercantile firm would not value these matters even at a low figure. Rather we must turn for the sympathy we seek to yon pilgrim student come from a semi-barbarous land to that small corner of the earth, as to a shrine, where he might take his fill of gazing on those emblems and coruscations of invisible and originate perfection. It was the stranger from a remote province, from Britain or from Mauritania, who in a scene so different from that of his chilly, woody swamps, or of his fiery choking sands, learned at once what a real university must be, by coming to understand the sort of country, which was its suitable home. Nor was this all that a university required, and found in Athens. No one, even there, could live on poetry. If the students at that famous place had nothing better than bright hues and soothing sounds, they would not have been able or disposed to turn their residence there to much account. Of course they must have the means of living, nay, in a certain sense, of enjoyment, if Athens was to be an alma mater at the time, or to remain afterwards a pleasant thought in their memory. And so they had, be it recollected Athens was a port, and a mart of trade, perhaps the first in Greece, and this was very much to the point, when a number of strangers were ever flocking to it, whose combat was to be with intellectual, not physical difficulties, and who claimed to have their bodily wants supplied, that they might be at leisure to set about furnishing their minds. Now, barren as was the soil of Attica, and bare the face of the country, yet it had only too many resources for an elegant, nay luxurious abode there. So abundant were the imports of the place, that it was a common saying, that the productions, which were found singly elsewhere, were brought all together in Athens. Corn and wine, the staple of subsistence in such a climate, came from the isles of the Aegean, fine wool and carpeting from Asia Minor, slaves, as, now, from the Euxine, and timber too, and iron and brass from the coasts of the Mediterranean. The Athenian did not condescend to manufactures himself, but encouraged them in others, and a population of foreigners caught at the lucrative occupation both for home consumption and for exportation. Their cloth, and other textures for dress and furniture, and their hardware, for instance, armor, were in great request. Labor was cheap, stone and marble in plenty, and the taste and skill, which at first were devoted to public buildings, as temples and porticos, were in course of time applied to the mansions of public men. If nature did much for Athens, it is undeniable that art did much more. Here someone will interrupt me with the remark, by the by, where are we, and whither are we going? What has all this to do with a university? At least what has it to do with education? It is instructive doubtless, but still how much has it to do with your subject? Now I beg to assure reader that I am most conscientiously employed upon my subject, and I should have thought every one would have seen this. However, since the objection is made, I may be allowed to pause a while, and show distinctly the drift of what I have been saying, before I go farther. What has this to do with my subject? Why, the question of the site is the very first that comes into consideration, when a stadium general is contemplated, for that site should be a liberal and noble one. Who will deny it? All authorities agree in this, and very little reflection will be sufficient to make it clear. I recollect a conversation I once had on this very subject with a very eminent man. I was a youth of 18, and was leaving my university for the long vacation, when I found myself in company in a public conveyance with a middle-aged person, whose face was strange to me. However, it was the great academical luminary of the day, whom afterwards I knew very well. Luckily for me, I did not suspect it, and luckily too, it was a fancy of his, as his friends knew, to make himself on easy terms especially with stagecoach companions. So, what with my flippancy and his condescension, I managed to hear many things which were novel to me at the time, and one point which he was strong upon, and was evidently fond of urging, was the material pomp and circumstance which should environ a great seat of learning. He considered it was worth the consideration of the government, whether Oxford should not stand in a domain of its own. An ample range, say 4 miles in diameter, should be turned into wood and meadow, and the university should be approached on all sides by a magnificent park, with fine trees in groups and groves and avenues, and with glimpses and views of the fair city, as the traveller drew near it. There is nothing surely absurd in the idea, though it would cost a round sum to realize it. What has a better claim to the purest and fairest possessions of nature, than the seat of wisdom? So thought my coach companion, and he did but express the tradition of ages and the instinct of mankind. For instance, take the great University of Paris. That famous school engrossed as its territory the whole south bank of the Seine, and occupied one half, and that the pleasanter half, of the city. King Louis had the island pretty well as his own, it was scarcely more than a fortification, and the north of the river was given over to the nobles and citizens to do what they could with its marshes, but the eligible south, rising from the stream, which swept around its base, to the fair summit of Saint Genevieve, with its broad meadows, its vineyards and its gardens, and with the sacred elevation of Montmartre confronting it, all this was the inheritance of the university. There was that pleasant pratum, stretching along the river's bank, in which the students for centuries took their recreation, which Alcuin seems to mention in his farewell verses to Paris, and which has given a name to the great abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. For long years it was devoted to the purposes of innocent and healthy enjoyment, but evil times came on the university, disorder arose within its precincts, and the fair meadow became the scene of party brawls, heresy stalked through Europe, and Germany and England no longer sending their contingent of students. A heavy debt was the consequence to the academical body. To let their land was the only resource left to them, buildings rose upon it, and spread along the green sod, and the country at length became town. Great was the grief and indignation of the doctors and masters, when this catastrophe occurred. A wretched sight, said the proctor of the German nation, a wretched sight, to witness the sale of that ancient manor, whither the muses were wont to wander for retirement and pleasure. Whither shall the youthful student now betake himself? What relief will he find for his eyes, wearied with intense reading, now that the pleasant stream is taken from him? 2 centuries and more have passed since this complaint was uttered, and time has shown that the outward calamity, which it recorded, was but the emblem of the great moral revolution, which was to follow, till the institution itself has followed its green meadows, into the region of things which once were and now are not. And in like manner, when they were first contemplating a university in Belgium, some centuries ago, many, says Lipsius, suggested Mechlin, as an abode salubrious and clean, but Louvain was preferred, as for other reasons, so because no city seemed from the disposition of place and people, more suitable for learned leisure. Who will not approve the decision? Can a site be healthier or more pleasant? The atmosphere pure and cheerful, the spaces open and delightful, meadows, fields, vines, groves, nay, I may say, a rus in urbe. Ascend and walk round the walls, what do you look down upon? Does not the wonderful and delightful variety smooth the brow and soothe the mind? You have corn, and apples, and grapes, sheep and oxen, and birds chirping or singing. Now carry your feet or your eyes beyond the walls, there are streamlets, the river meandering along, country houses, convents, the superb fortress, copses or woods fill up the scene, and spots for simple enjoyment. And then he breaks out into poetry. Solvate Atheni Nostri, Athens Belgici. Te Gallus, te Germanus, et te Sarmata. Invisit, et Britannius, et te Duplicis. Hispanilumnus, etc. Extravagant, then, and wayward as might be the thought of my learned coach companion, when, in the 19th century, he imagined, Norman-wise, to turn a score of villages into a park or pleasure haunts, still, the waywardness of his fancy is excused by the justness of his principle, for certainly, such as he would have made it, a university ought to be. Old Anthony Wood, discoursing on the demands of a university, had expressed the same sentiment long before him, as Horace in ancient times, with reference to Athens itself, when he spoke of seeking truth in the groves of Academe. And to Athens, as will be seen, Wood himself appeals, when he would discourse of Oxford. Among those things which are required to make a university, he puts down: first, a good and pleasant site, where there is a wholesome and temperate constitution of the air, composed with waters, springs or wells, woods and pleasant fields, which being obtained, those commodities are enough to invite students to stay and abide there. As the Athenians in ancient times were happy for their conveniences, so also were the Britons, when by a remnant of the Grecians that came amongst them, they or their successors selected such a place in Britain to plant a school or schools therein, which for its pleasant situation was afterwards called Belozitum or Belazit, now Oxford, privileged with all those conveniences before mentioned. By others the local advantages of that university have been more philosophically analysed, for instance, with a reference to its position in the middle of southern England, its situation on several islands in a broad plain, through which many streams flowed, the surrounding marshes, which, in times when it was needed, protected the city from invaders, its own strength as a military position, its easy communication with London, nay with the sea, by means of the Thames, while the London fortifications hindered pirates from ascending the stream, which all the time was so ready and convenient for a descent. Alas! For centuries past that city has lost its prime honour and boast, as a servant and soldier of the truth. Once named the second school of the Church, second only to Paris, the foster mother of St. Edmund, St. Richard, St. Thomas Cantilupe, the theatre of great intellects, of Scotus the subtle doctor, of Hales the irrefragable, of Ockham the special, of Bacon the admirable, of Middleton the solid, and of Bradwardine the profound, Oxford has now lapsed to that level of mere human loveliness, which in its highest perfection we admire in Athens. Nor would it have a place, now or hereafter, in these pages, nor would it occur to me to speak its name, except that, even in its sorrowful deprivation, it still retains so much of that outward lustre, which, like the brightness on the prophet's face, ought to be a ray from an illumination within, as to afford me an illustration of the point on which I am engaged, viz., what should be the material dwelling place and appearance, the local circumstances, and the secular concomitants of a great university. Pictures are drawn in tales of romance, of spirits seemingly too beautiful in their fall to be really fallen, and the holy Pope at Rome, Gregory, in fact, and not in fiction, looked upon the blue eyes and golden hair of the fierce Saxon youth in the slave market, and pronounced them angels, not angels, and the spell which this once loyal daughter of the Church still exercises upon the foreign visitor, even now when her true glory is departed, suggests to us how far more majestic and more touching, how brimful of indescribable influence would be the presence of a university, which was planted within, not without Jerusalem, an influence, potent as her truth is strong, wide as her sway is worldwide, and growing, not lessening, by the extent of space over which its attraction would be exerted. Let the reader then listen to the words of the last learned German, who has treated of Oxford, and judge for himself if they do not bear me out, in what I have said of the fascination which the very face and smile of a university possess over those who come within its range. There is scarce a spot in the world, says Huber, that bears an historical stamp so deep and varied as Oxford, where so many noble memorials of moral and material power co-operating to an honourable end, meet the eye all at once. He who can be proof against the strong emotions which the whole aspect and genius of the place tend to inspire, must be dull, thoughtless, uneducated, or of very perverted views. Others will bear us witness, that, even side by side with the eternal Rome, the alma mater of Oxford may be fitly named, as producing a deep, a lasting, and peculiar impression. In one of the most fertile districts of the Queen of the Seas, whom nature has so richly blessed, whom for centuries past no footstep of foreign armies has desecrated, lies a broad green vale, where the Cherwell and the Isis mingle their full, clear waters. Here and there primeval elms and oaks overshadow them, while in their various windings they encircle gardens, meadows, and fields, villages, cottages, farmhouses, and country seats, in motley mixture. In the midst rises a mass of mighty buildings, the general character of which varies between convent, palace, and castle. Some few Gothic church towers and Romaic domes, it is true, break through the horizontal lines, yet the general impression at a distance and at first sight, is essentially different from that of any of the towns of the Middle Ages. The outlines are far from being so sharp, so angular, so irregular, so fantastical. A certain softness, a peculiar repose, reigns in those broader, terrace-like rising masses. Only in the creations of Claude Lorraine or Poussin could we expect to find a spot to compare with the prevailing character of this picture, especially when lit up by a favorable light. The principal masses consist of colleges, the university buildings, and the city churches, and by the side of these the city itself is lost on distant view. But on entering the streets, we find around us all the signs of an active and prosperous trade. Rich and elegant shops in profusion afford a sight to be found nowhere but in England, but with all this glitter and show, they sink into a modest, and, as it were, a menial attitude, by the side of the grandly severe memorials of the higher intellectual life, memorials which have been growing out of that life from almost the beginning of Christianity itself. Those rich and elegant shops are, as it were, the domestic offices of these palaces of learning, which ever rivet the eye of the observer, while all besides seems perforce to be subservient to them. Each of the larger and more ancient colleges looks like a separate whole, an entire town, whose walls and monuments proclaim the vigorous growth of many centuries, and the town itself has happily escaped the lot of modern beautifying, and in this respect harmonizes with the colleges. There are those who, having felt the influence of this ancient school, and being smit with its splendor and its sweetness, ask wistfully, if never again it is to be Catholic, or whether at least some footing for Catholicity may not be found there. All honor and merit to the charitable and zealous hearts who so inquire. Nor can we dare to tell what in time to come may be the inscrutable purposes of that grace, which is ever more comprehensive than human hope and aspiration. But for me, from the day I left its walls, I never, for good or bad, have had anticipation of its future, and never for a moment have I had a wish to see again a place, which I have never ceased to love, and where I lived for nearly 30 years. Nay, looking at the general state of things at this day, I desiderati for a school of the Church, if an additional school is to be granted to us, a more central position than Oxford has to show. Since the age of Alfred and of the first Henry, the world has grown, from the west and south of Europe, into 4 or 5 continents, and I look for a city less inland than that old sanctuary, and a country closer upon the highway of the seas. I look towards a land both old and young, old in its Christianity, young in the promise of its future, a nation, which received grace before the Saxon came to Britain, and which has never quenched it, a church, which comprehends in its history the rise and fall of Canterbury and York, which Augustine and Paulinus found, and Pole and Fisher left behind them. I contemplate a people which has had a long night, and will have an inevitable day. I am turning my eyes towards 100 years to come, and I dimly see the island I am gazing on, become the road of passage and union between 2 hemispheres, and the center of the world. I see its inhabitants rival Belgium in populousness, France in vigor, and Spain in enthusiasm, and I see England taught by advancing years to exercise in its behalf that good sense which is her characteristic towards everyone else. The capital of that prosperous and hopeful land is situate in a beautiful bay and near a romantic region, and in it I see a flourishing university, which for a while had to struggle with fortune, but which, when its first founders and servants were dead and gone, had successes far exceeding their anxieties. Thither, as to a sacred soil, the home of their fathers, and the fountainhead of their Christianity, students are flocking from east, west, and south, from America and Australia and India, from Egypt and Asia Minor, with the ease and rapidity of a locomotion not yet discovered, and last, though not least, from England, all speaking one tongue, all owning one faith, all eager for one large true wisdom, and thence, when their stay is over, going back again to carry over all the earth peace to men of goodwill. 3. University life at Athens. However apposite may have been the digression into which I was led when I had got about half through the foregoing chapter, it has had the inconvenience of what may be called running me off the rails, and now that I wish to proceed from the point at which it took place, I shall find some trouble, if I may continue the metaphor, in getting up the steam again, or if I may change it, in getting into the swing of my subject. It has been my desire, were I able, to bring before the reader what Athens may have been, viewed as what we have since called a university, and to do this, not with any purpose of writing a panegyric on a heathen city, or of denying its many deformities, or of concealing what was morally base in what was intellectually great, but just the contrary, of representing things as they really were, so far, that is, as to enable him to see what a university is, in the very constitution of society and in its own idea, what is its nature and object, and what it needs of aid and support external to itself to complete that nature and to secure that object. So now let us fancy our Scythian, or Armenian, or African, or Italian, or Gallic student, after tossing on the Saronic waves, which would be his more ordinary course to Athens, at last casting anchor at Piraeus. He is of any condition or rank of life you please, and may be made to order, from a prince to a peasant. Perhaps he is some Cleanthes, who has been a boxer in the public games. How did it ever cross his brain to betake himself to Athens in search of wisdom? Or, if he came thither by accident, how did the love of it ever touch his heart? But so it was, to Athens he came with 3 drams in his girdle, and he got his livelihood by drawing water, carrying loads, and the like servile occupations. He attached himself, of all philosophers, to Zeno the Stoic, to Zeno, the most high-minded, the most haughty of speculators, and out of his daily earnings the poor scholar brought his master the daily sum of an obolus, in payment for attending his lectures. Such progress did he make, that on Zeno's death he actually was his successor in his school, and, if my memory does not play me false, he is the author of a hymn to the Supreme Being, which is one of the noblest effusions of the kind in classical poetry. Yet, even when he was the head of a school, he continued in his illiberal toil as if he had been a monk, and, it is said, that once, when the wind took his pallium, and blew it aside, he was discovered to have no other garment at all, something like the German student who came up to Heidelberg with nothing upon him but a greatcoat and a pair of pistols. Or it is another disciple of the Porch, Stoic by nature, earlier than by profession, who is entering the city, but in what different fashion he comes. It is no other than Marcus, emperor of Roman philosopher. Professors long since were summoned from Athens for his service, when he was a youth, and now he comes, after his victories in the battlefield, to make his acknowledgments at the end of life, to the city of wisdom, and to submit himself to an initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries. Or it is a young man of great promise as an orator, were it not for his weakness of chest, which renders it necessary that he should acquire the art of speaking without over-exertion, and should adopt a delivery sufficient for the display of his rhetorical talents on the one hand, yet merciful to his physical resources on the other. He is called Cicero. He will stop but a short time, and will pass over to Asia Minor and its cities, before he returns to continue a career which will render his name immortal, and he will like his short sojourn at Athens so well, that he will take good care to send his son thither at an earlier age than he visited it himself. But see where comes from Alexandria, for we need not be very solicitous about anachronisms, a young man from 20 to 22, who has narrowly escaped drowning on his voyage, and is to remain at Athens as many as 8 or 10 years, yet in the course of that time will not learn a line of Latin, thinking it enough to become accomplished in Greek composition, and in that he will succeed. He is a grave person, and difficult to make out. Some say he is a Christian, something or other in the Christian line his father is for certain. His name is Gregory, He is by country a Cappadocian, and will in time become preeminently a theologian, and one of the principal doctors of the Greek Church. Or it is one Horace, a youth of low stature and black hair, whose father has given him an education at Rome above his rank in life, and now is sending him to finish it at Athens. He is said to have a turn for poetry. A hero he is not, and it were well if he knew it, but he is caught by the enthusiasm of the hour, and goes off campaigning with Brutus and Cassius, and will leave his shield behind him on the field of Philippi. Or it is a mere boy of 15, his name Eunupius, though the voyage was not long, seasickness, or confinement, or bad living on board the vessel, threw him into a fever, and, when the passengers landed in the evening at Piraeus, he could not stand. His countrymen who accompanied him, took him up among them and carried him to the house of the great teacher of the day, Proeresius, who was a friend of the captain's, and whose fame it was which drew the enthusiastic youth to Athens. His companions understand the sort of place they are in, and, with the license of academic students, they break into the philosopher's house, though he appears to have retired for the night, and proceed to make themselves free of it, with an absence of ceremony, which is only not impudence, because Proeresius takes it so easily. Strange introduction for our stranger to a seat of learning, but not out of keeping with Athens, for what could you expect of a place where there was a mob of youths and not even the pretence of control, where the poorer lived anyhow, and got on as they could, and the teachers themselves had no protection from the humours and caprices of the students who filled their lecture halls. However, as to this Eunupius, Proeresius took a fancy to the boy, and told him curious stories about Athenian life. He himself had come up to the university with one Hephaestion, and they were even worse off than Cleanthes the Stoic, for they had only one cloak between them, and nothing whatever besides, except some old bedding. So when Proeresius went abroad, Hephaestion lay in bed, and practised himself in oratory, and then Hephaestion put on the cloak, and Proeresius crept under the coverlet. At another time there was so fierce a feud between what would be called town and gown in an English university, that the professors did not dare lecture in public, for fear of ill treatment. But a freshman like Eunupius soon got experience for himself of the ways and manners prevalent in Athens. Such a one as he had hardly entered the city, when he was caught hold of by a party of the academic youth, who proceeded to practice on his awkwardness and his ignorance. At first sight one wonders at their childishness, but the like conduct obtained in the medieval universities, and not many months have passed away since the journals have told us of sober Englishmen, given to matter-of-fact calculations, and to the anxieties of money-making, pelting each other with snowballs on their own sacred territory, and defying the magistracy, when they would interfere with their privilege of becoming boys. So I suppose we must attribute it to something or other in human nature. Meanwhile, there stands the newcomer, surrounded by a circle of his new associates, who forthwith proceed to frighten, and to banter, and to make a fool of him, to the extent of their wit. Some address him with mock politeness, others with fierceness, and so they conduct him in solemn procession across the agora to the baths, and as they approach, they dance about him like madmen. But this was to be the end of his trial, for the bath was a sort of initiation. He thereupon received the pallium, or university gown, and was suffered by his tormentors to depart in peace. One alone is recorded as having been exempted from this persecution. It was a youth graver and loftier than even Saint Gregory himself, but it was not from his force of character, but at the instance of Gregory, that he escaped. Gregory was his bosom friend, and was ready in Athens to shelter him when he came. It was another saint and doctor, the great Basil, then, it would appear, as Gregory, but a catechumen of the Church. But to return to our freshman. His troubles are not at an end, though he has got his gown upon him. Where is he to lodge? Whom is he to attend? He finds himself seized, before he well knows where he is, by another party of men, or 3 or 4 parties at once, like foreign porters at a landing, who seize on the baggage of the perplexed stranger, and thrust half a dozen cards into his unwilling hands. Our youth is plied by the hangers-on of Professor this, or Sophist that, each of whom wishes the fame or the profit of having a house full. We will say that he escapes from their hands, but then he will have to choose for himself where he will put up, and, to tell the truth, with all the praise I have already given, and the praise I shall have to give, to the city of mind, nevertheless, between ourselves, the brick and wood which formed it, the actual tenements, where flesh and blood had to lodge, always excepting the mansions of great men of the place, do not seem to have been much better than those of Greek or Turkish towns, which are at this moment a topic of interest and ridicule in the public prints. A lively picture has lately been set before us of Gallipoli. Take, says the writer, a multitude of the dilapidated outhouses found in farmyards in England, of the rickety old wooden tenements, the cracked, shutterless structures of planks and tiles, the sheds and stalls, which our by-lanes, or fish markets, or riversides can supply, tumble them down on the declivity of a bare bald hill, let the spaces between house and house, thus accidentally determined, be understood to form streets, winding of course for no reason, and with no meaning, up and down the town, the roadway always narrow, the breadth never uniform, the separate houses bulging or retiring below, as circumstances may have determined, and leaning forward till they meet overhead, and you have a good idea of Gallipoli. I question whether this picture would not nearly correspond to the special seat of the Muses in ancient times. Learned writers assure us distinctly that the houses of Athens were for the most part small and mean, that the streets were crooked and narrow, that the upper stories projected over the roadway, and that staircases, balustrades, and doors that opened outwards, obstructed it, a remarkable coincidence of description. I do not doubt at all, though history is silent, that roadway was jolting to carriages, and all but impassable, and that it was traversed by drains, as freely as any Turkish town now. Athens seems in these respects to have been below the average cities of its time. A stranger, says an ancient, might doubt, on the sudden view, if really he saw Athens. I grant all this, and much more, if you will, but, recollect, Athens was the home of the intellectual, and beautiful, not of low mechanical contrivances, and material organization. Why stop within your lodgings counting the rents in your wall or the holes in your tiling, when nature and art call you away? You must put up with such a chamber, and a table, and a stool, and a sleeping board, anywhere else in the 3 continents. One place does not differ from another indoors. Your megalia in Africa, or your grottos in Syria are not perfection. I suppose you did not come to Athens to swarm up a ladder, or to grope about a closet. You came to see and to hear, what hear and see you could not elsewhere. What food for the intellect is it possible to procure indoors, that you stay there looking about you? Do you think to read there? Where are your books? Do you expect to purchase books at Athens? You are much out in your calculations. True it is, we at this day, who live in the 19th century, have the books of Greece as a perpetual memorial, and copies there have been, since the time that they were written, but you need not go to Athens to procure them, nor would you find them in Athens. Strange to say, strange to the 19th century, that in the age of Plato and Thucydides, there was not, it is said, a bookshop in the whole place, nor was the book trade in existence till the very time of Augustus. Libraries, I suspect, were the bright invention of Attalus or the Ptolemies. I doubt whether Athens had a library till the reign of Hadrian. It was what the student gazed on, what he heard, what he caught by the magic of sympathy, not what he read, which was the education furnished by Athens. He leaves his narrow lodging early in the morning, and not till night, if even then, will he return. It is but a crib or kennel, in which he sleeps when the weather is inclement or the ground damp, in no respect a home. And he goes out of doors, not to read the day's newspaper, or to buy the gay shilling volume, but to imbibe the invisible atmosphere of genius, and to learn by heart the oral traditions of taste. Out he goes, and, leaving the tumble-down town behind him, he mounts the Acropolis to the right, or he turns to the Areopagus on the left. He goes to the Parthenon to study the sculptures of Phidias, to the temple of the Dioscuri to see the paintings of Polygnotus. We indeed take our Sophocles or Aeschylus out of our coat pocket, but, if our sojourner at Athens would understand how a tragic poet can write, he must betake himself to the theatre on the south, and see and hear the drama literally in action. Or let him go westward to the Agora, and there he will hear Lysias or Andocides pleading, or Demosthenes haranguing. He goes farther west still, along the shade of those noble plains, which Simon has planted there, and he looks around him at the statues and porticos and vestibules, each by itself a work of genius and skill, enough to be the making of another city. He passes through the city gate, and then he is at the famous Ceramicus. Here are the tombs of the mighty dead, and here, we will suppose, is Pericles himself, the most elevated, the most thrilling of orators, converting a funeral oration over the slain into a philosophical panegyric of the living. Onwards he proceeds still, and now he has come to that still more celebrated academe, which has bestowed its own name on universities down to this day, and there he sees a sight which will be graven on his memory till he dies. Many are the beauties of the place, the groves, and the statues, and the temple, and the stream of the Cephissus flowing by. Many are the lessons which will be taught him day after day by teacher or by companion, but his eye is just now arrested by one object. It is the very presence of Plato. He does not hear a word that he says, he does not care to hear, he asks neither for discourse nor disputation. What he sees is a whole, complete in itself, not to be increased by addition, and greater than anything else. It will be a point in the history of his life, a stay for his memory to rest on, a burning thought in his heart, a bond of union with men of like mind, ever afterwards. Such is the spell which the living man exerts on his fellows, for good or for evil. How nature impels us to lean upon others, making virtue, or genius, or name, the qualification for our doing so. A Spaniard is said to have travelled to Italy, simply to see Livy. He had his fill of gazing, and then went back again home. Had our young stranger got nothing by his voyage but the sight of the breathing and moving Plato, had he entered no lecture room to hear, no gymnasium to converse, he had got some measure of education, and something to tell of to his grandchildren. But Plato is not the only sage, nor the sight of him the only lesson to be learned in this wonderful suburb. It is the region and the realm of philosophy. Colleges were the inventions of many centuries later, and they imply a sort of cloistered life, or at least a life of rule, scarcely natural to an Athenian. It was the boast of the philosophic statesman of Athens, that his countrymen achieved by the mere force of nature and the love of the noble and the great, what other people aimed at by laborious discipline, and all who came among them were submitted to the same method of education. We have traced our student on his wanderings from the Acropolis to the Sacred Way, and now he is in the region of the schools. No awful arch, no window of many-coloured lights marks the seats of learning there or elsewhere. Philosophy lives out of doors. No close atmosphere oppresses the brain or inflames the eyelid, no long session stiffens the limbs. Epicurus is reclining in his garden, Zeno looks like a divinity in his porch, the restless Aristotle, on the other side of the city, as if in antagonism to Plato, is walking his pupils off their legs in his lyceum by the Ilissus. Our student has determined on entering himself as a disciple of Theophrastus, a teacher of marvelous popularity, who has brought together 2,000 pupils from all parts of the world. He himself is of Lesbos, for masters, as well as students, come hither from all regions of the earth, as befits a university. How could Athens have collected hearers in such numbers, unless she had selected teachers of such power? It was the range of territory, which the notion of a university implies, which furnished both the quantity of the one, and the quality of the other. Anaxagoras was from Ionia, Carneades from Africa, Zeno from Cyprus, Protagoras from Thrace, and Gorgias from Sicily. Andromachus was a Syrian, Proerasius an Armenian, Hilarius a Bithynian, Philiscus a Thessalian, Hadrian a Syrian. Rome is celebrated for her liberality in civil matters. Athens was as liberal in intellectual. There was no narrow jealousy, directed against a professor, because he was not an Athenian. Genius and talent were the qualifications, and to bring them to Athens, was to do homage to it as a university. There was a brotherhood and a citizenship of mind. Mind came first, and was the foundation of the academical polity, but it soon brought along with it, and gathered round itself, the gifts of fortune and the prizes of life. As time went on, wisdom was not always sentenced to the bare cloak of Cleanthes, but beginning in rags, it ended in fine linen. The professors became honourable and rich, and the students ranged themselves under their names, and were proud of calling themselves their countrymen. The university was divided into 4 great nations, as the medieval antiquarian would style them, and in the middle of the 4th century, Proerasius was the leader or proctor of the Attic, Hephaestion of the Oriental, Epiphanius of the Arabic, and Diophantus of the Pontic. Thus the professors were both patrons of clients, and hosts and proxeni of strangers and visitors, as well as masters of the schools, and the Cappadocian, Syrian, or Sicilian youth who came to one or other of them, would be encouraged to study by his protection, and to aspire by his example. Even Plato, when the schools of Athens were not 100 years old, was in circumstances to enjoy the otium cum dignitate. He had a villa out at Heraclea, and he left his patrimony to his school, in whose hands it remained, not only safe, but fructifying, a marvellous phenomenon in tumultuous Greece, for the long space of 800 years. Epicurus too had the property of the gardens where he lectured, and these too became the property of his sect. But in Roman times the chairs of grammar, rhetoric, politics, and the 4 philosophies, were handsomely endowed by the state. Some of the professors were themselves statesmen or high functionaries, and brought to their favourite study senatorial rank or Asiatic opulence. Patrons such as these can compensate to the freshman, in whom we have interested ourselves, for the poorness of his lodging and the turbulence of his companions. In everything there is a better side and a worse, in every place a disreputable set and a respectable, and the one is hardly known at all to the other. Men come away from the same university at this day, with contradictory impressions and contradictory statements, according to the society they have found there. If you believe the one, nothing goes on there as it should be; if you believe the other, nothing goes on as it should not. Virtue, however, and decency are at least in the minority everywhere, and under some sort of a cloud or disadvantage, and this being the case, it is so much gain whenever an Herodes Atticus is found, to throw the influence of wealth and station on the side even of a decorous philosophy. A consular man, and the heir of an ample fortune, this Herod was content to devote his life to a professorship, and his fortune to the patronage of literature. He gave the sophist Polemo about £8,000, as the sum is calculated, for 3 declamations. He built at Athens a stadium 600 feet long, entirely of white marble, and capable of admitting the whole population. His theatre, erected to the memory of his wife, was made of cedar wood curiously carved. He had 2 villas, one at Marathon, the place of his birth, about 10 miles from Athens, the other at Cephiscia, at the distance of 6, and thither he drew to him the elite, and at times the whole body of the students. Long arcades, groves of trees, clear pools for the bath, delighted and recruited the summer visitor. Never was so brilliant a lecture room as his evening banqueting hall. Highly connected students from Rome mixed with the sharp-witted provincial of Greece or Asia Minor, and the flippant stylist, and the nondescript visitor, half philosopher, half tramp, met with a reception, courteous always, but suitable to his deserts. Herod was noted for his repartees, and we have instances on record of his setting down, according to the emergency, both the one and the other. A higher line, though a rarer one, was that allotted to the youthful Basil. He was one of those men who seem by a sort of fascination to draw others around them even without wishing it. One might have deemed that his gravity and his reserve would have kept them at a distance, but, almost in spite of himself, he was the centre of a knot of youths, who, pagans as most of them were, used Athens honestly for the purpose for which they professed to seek it, and, disappointed and displeased with the place himself, he seems nevertheless to have been the means of their profiting by its advantages. One of these was Sophronius, who afterwards held a high office in the state. Eusebius was another, at that time the bosom friend of Sophronius, and afterwards a bishop. Celsus too is named, who afterwards was raised to the government of Cilicia by the Emperor Julian. Julian himself, in the sequel of unhappy memory, was then at Athens, and known at least to Saint Gregory. Another Julian is also mentioned, who was afterwards commissioner of the land tax. Here we have a glimpse of the better kind of society among the students of Athens, and it is to the credit of the parties composing it, that such young men as Gregory and Basil, men as intimately connected with Christianity, as they were well known in the world, should hold so high a place in their esteem and love. When the two saints were departing, their companions came around them with the hope of changing their purpose. Basil persevered, but Gregory relented, and turned back to Athens for a season. End of the topic. Thank you.